Welcome to Veritate with your host, Johnny Mack, a podcast that will dive deep into the pursuit of truth in a world filled with noise, confusion, and fleeting opinions. We will seek to uncover the eternal, unshakable truths that shape our lives and our beliefs, from faith and philosophy to history and culture. We'll explore the questions that matter, challenge the answers we've been given, and seek the wisdom that has stood the test of time. So join Johnny Mack in this journey to discover what's real, what's right, and what's true.
Today on Veritate, this is Johnny Mack, and I need to start out by coming clean. Not performing for you without polishing anything and without hiding behind any of the research language that I've used. When I had decided in 2012 to seriously examine the world's religions, I didn't start with Christianity, and I told myself that I was being objective about it. I told myself that I was being systematic. I told myself I would work through the religions the way a serious man should, going one by one, weighing the claims, discarding what failed, and then keeping what held. And that's only partly true, because the truth is simpler, but it's also uglier. I skipped Christianity because I did not want Christ to be true. And I need you to hear that as a confession. It's not a hook line or anything else. I avoided Christ because I did not want him to be true. I did not want his words to be true. I didn't want his authority to be real, and I didn't want his judgment to be possible. I did not want his claim on my life. But I can also tell you why. Because Christianity wasn't a neutral topic for me. It's been tied to my earliest pain, to the denominational chaos that was around me in the South, to a father who mocked the whole thing. And listen, I've told you before, I grew up in the South. Churches were everywhere. Different denominations were everywhere. People said the name of Jesus as if it settled an argument. And then those same people would argue with each other. And so they would split, they would judge each other, they acted as though they alone understood the Bible. And that was in the very air that I breathed and everywhere I went. And I've explained before, my father was an alcoholic and he rejected Christianity. And he said that Jesus was made up. And he didn't say that quietly either. He said it with certainty. He said it with contempt. He said it like a man who was proud of his own independence. And he modeled a kind of hard disbelief. And as I said before, in my house, unbelief did not look like uncertainty. It looked like dismissal. But there's this part I can't soften. My abuse began when I was 4 years old. And I remember being 5 years old, going to a Protestant church with my Mama Margie. And I remember standing in front of this church singing Jesus Loves the Little Children. I can remember the melody. I remember the kids singing. I remember the group. But I also remember the words landing inside of me like an accusation. Because at 5 years old, I thought, that cannot be true. And at least not for me. Now, that's not theology. That's just a child that's trying to reconcile a claim with reality. Because if Jesus loves the little children, and then this is happening to me, then one of two things must be true. Either A, he doesn't exist, or B, if he does exist, he doesn't love me. And so that thought formed me early, and it didn't go away. It didn't get solved by growing older. It actually hardened, and it hardened quietly. It hardened into suspicion, and then into rejection. So when you hear me say that I avoided Christ because I didn't want him to be true, I mean that. Because if Christ is true, then the childhood conclusion might be wrong. If Christ is true, then I might not be a victim of a universe that does not care. If Christ is true, then I might be accountable to a God who sees everything. If Christ is true, then I have to face a claim that I did not want to face. I didn't want that. I wanted distance. And I wanted control, and I wanted to remain the judge. And that is why I skipped Christianity. Because I had told myself that Christianity looked fractured, and it is, with 45,000 denominations and 40,000 non-denominationals. That sounds like proof enough that the whole thing was man-made. And I told myself I couldn't wade into that confusion first. I told myself I would return to it later. And I did return later, but not until all of the other things collapsed. And I have to explain to you what happened between going to Iraq in 2005 and then 2012, because that matters. Because while I was in Iraq, I had to pretend to be a Muslim. In order for me to train the 210 Iraqi Army Battalion, I had to pretend. And that is not a spiritual statement. That is a tactical reality. Religion in the Middle East is not a private hobby. It shapes their identity, their loyalty, their hostility, and the social air that you breathe there. And I saw religion there used to rally, to intimidate, to separate people into categories. In Iraq, I saw religion as a problem. I saw it as fuel. I saw it as a tool. I saw it as something that you could weaponize. And that experience did not make me curious about God. It made me more suspicious of any religious claims. Now look, my father died before I deployed. And then I deployed, and then I came home, and I had to visit the families of Vic and Joey. And look, Joey's family, man, Joey Hunt's family, man, they loved us. They still love us. They welcomed us home. They honored us. But Vic's family is a little different, because they looked at us as though we had failed, as though decisions were made, and they put Vic in harm's way, and it shouldn't have done that. And so I've got love from one family, and I've got blame from another. And I got all of it wrapped up in grief. And so that combination will do something to you, because it makes you feel like the weight of a moral reality. And it tempts you to bitterness. It tempts you to say that if God exists, he's either absent or he's cruel. And I didn't say that as neatly then, but I lived it. Because from 2005 to 2012, I carried a posture that was not a calm atheist. It was an accusation. And it was, God probably does not exist, but if he does, then he's not innocent. And so that is why the New Age appealed to me later on, because it offered a way to talk about spirit without kneeling before any kind of a personal God. It offered a spirituality without judgment, and it offered me a universe without a face. And a faceless universe cannot disappoint a child. A faceless universe cannot see, and it can do nothing. And it certainly can't judge. And so that felt safer. So in 2012, when I decided to try to figure all of this out, I went searching. And I certainly did not start at the place that hurt. I started at the places that felt less personal. And so after working through all of the previous systems that we've discussed, I landed in the New Age. Now look, this is not about mocking people who read New Age books. This episode is about me explaining why I found them plausible, why I invested in them, and why they eventually failed the very question they promised to answer. Because those questions stay constant. Who is God? Who is man? What went wrong? And how's it fixed? And even as an atheist, those questions existed. And they existed because death exists, because evil exists, because conscience exists. The human longing for meaning exists. And you can deny God and still feel the pressure of those questions, because you cannot deny reality. But when we begin the first New Age, I want to begin with the first New Age voice that truly caught me. And that is Neale Donald Walsch. I don't know if you've read any of his books, but I was enthralled by Neale Donald Walsch, because this wasn't a casual detour for me. He was a serious commitment, because I collected his Conversations with God series, and I wanted the whole arc. I wanted to see whether his claims could survive the sustained attention, because his claim was very simple and it was very enormous. He said that God spoke to him. And so I thought, well, if God spoke to him, then atheism collapses immediately. And if atheism collapses, then my childhood conclusion also collapses. And if my childhood conclusion collapses, then everything changes. And so I began to read. I began to listen to audiobooks. And at first, I was enthralled with it, because Neale Donald Walsch's God didn't sound like the God I had resisted. His voice didn't condemn. It didn't threaten hell. It didn't speak like a commander. It spoke like a counselor. In fact, if you listen to the audiobooks, you'll find that he goes back and forth between a male and a female voice. But that voice says that there's no sin. And it says you cannot offend God. It says that all experiences serves growth. It says that judgment is unnecessary. And it said that fear is an illusion. And it said that the point is happiness and self-realization. And so that voice was very attractive to a man who did not want Christ to be true. Because what it does is it removes this moral courtroom, so to speak. It removes the idea of there being a judge. And it removes the idea of ultimate accountability. And it makes God safe because this God that he speaks of is non-demanding. And so if there is no sin, then the category that has haunted my conscience becomes a category that I can ignore. And if there's no sin, then I don't need to repent. And if there's no judgment, then I don't need to fear anything beyond consequence. And if there is no hell, then the moral horror of evil can be softened into learning. And so what Walsh offered was an explanation that let me keep my autonomy and still talk about God. But even when I was enthralled, the questions kept returning. And they return because these are not preferences. These are realities. Who is God? And according to Neil Donald Walsh, God speaks, but he doesn't command. He doesn't bind. There's no established law, and he doesn't say you must. He rarely even says no to anything. And a God who never says no is not sovereign. He may be comforting, of course, but he's not sovereign. And the question of who is man comes up. Walt says that man is divine in development, that man is not fallen, that man is not rebellious, that we're not guilty, that man is just learning and he's evolving. Now, at first, that sounds like compassion, and it certainly sounds like relief. But that's where the third question begins to press. What went wrong? And you see, Walsh couldn't answer this question, not without dissolving evil into a perspective. He had to treat evil as an experience, as it's a contrast or a lesson. And he has to say, in effect, nothing truly went wrong because everything serves growth. And I tried to accept that. But my life would not allow that. And because I had seen deliberate evil, I have seen intention. I've seen people make a choice. Look, I had been abused as a child. A child does not choose abuse. A child doesn't manifest abuse. And a child certainly does not grow through abuse in a way that these systems imply that they do. A child is violated. And when you've seen this violation, you can't accept a system that refuses to call that what it is. And that's where Walsh's system began to crack. Because it was a very slow and a nagging thing that would just stare at me. Because Walsh's system began to crack right there. Because it's a very slow and nagging thing that started to happen, because I found myself thinking that if there is no sin, then what do I call what happened to me? If there's no sin, what do I call what I saw in Iraq? If there's no sin at all, then justice is just a preference. And if that's just a preference, then the words wrong and evil are just emotional noise. The problem is they're not. And when you see deliberate cruelty, you're not merely uncomfortable with it. You recognize that violation. You recognize there's a moral rupture here. And that recognition implies that there's a standard. And that is where my atheist logic began to turn on me. In Iraq, religion. So look, in Iraq, let me go back to Iraq here for a moment, because it's not just a footnote. It's part of why the New Age logic failed for me. In Iraq, I had to pretend to be a Muslim in order to be able to train the Iraqis. And again, that's not about devotion. It's just about the mission, and it's about survival. And it put me inside this religious language as a tool. And that experience shaped my view of religion. It looked like something that could be used and something that could divide, and also something that could justify. So I saw religion as a problem while I was there. I saw people claiming to know God and to love God while they do evil at the same time. They would even praise God as they did evil. And these slogans, this identity markers, it's all wrapped around violence. I saw intentional harm. I saw planned harm. And then I saw it explained or excused with just spiritual language. Inshallah. God wills. And that does something to your mind. It makes you equate God talk with human manipulation. And then when you come home and you face grief, it gets worse. Because when I visited Vic and Joey's families, and Joey's family loved us and Vic's family blamed us, that contrast taught me something about human hearts. And that's that people react to grief in different ways. Love appears blame appears. Both of those are real. And that's where Walsh's system failed again. Because if nothing truly went wrong, then blame and love are both just experiences. But love and blame are not equal. One of these is good, and one of them can be unjust. So the moral categories pressed in once again. Good, evil, justice, injustice. No New Age system can survive those categories unless it grounds them. And it was this grounding that was the problem. Because the logic of moral grounding. As an atheist, I believe that the universe had laws. And those laws are simple: cause and effect, action and reaction. And I believed that reality was structured. I did not believe in a personal God, but I believed in an ordered world. And I also believed in a basic way that if something exists, then its opposite has to exist meaningfully. Because you can't talk about one without talking about the other. You can't define one of them without implying the other. In other words, if there's up, there's a down. If there's a light, there's a dark. If there's order, then there's disorder. And if there's good, there's evil. And so at first, I treated good and evil like these were social terms. I treated them like labels. But unfortunately, Iraq and even my own history made that impossible. Because I didn't merely dislike what I saw. I judged it. I didn't say, oh, that's inconvenient. I said that is wrong. And when you say wrong, you're actually saying something heavier than just preference. Because preference says, I don't like it. But wrong says, that should not be. And that word should matters. Because it implies an obligation. It implies that there's a law. And so I began to ask in my own atheistic logic, where does obligation come from? If morality is only a social agreement, then a society can agree that cruelty is fine. If morality is only survival advantage, then a clever man should break moral rules whenever he can profit. If morality is only an emotion, then outrage is just chemistry. But I did not experience outrage as chemistry. I experienced it as recognition. And it was a recognition of violation. So right there, I had to admit something. Some things are wrong even if everyone approves of them. And some things are wrong even if the wrongdoer benefits from it. And some things are wrong even if the victim is silenced. And if that is true, then morality is not merely social. It is objective. But if morality is objective, it needs grounding. Because a floating moral law doesn't make any sense. A law implies that there's a lawgiver, and a standard implies that there's an authority. And that is where my own logic started to corner me. Because if evil exists, then good exists. And if good exists objectively, it must be grounded beyond human opinion. So if it's grounded beyond human opinion, then there's an authority beyond man. And that authority implies accountability. And accountability implies judgment. And that is what I resisted the most. Because judgment now means my life is not mine. Judgment means my autonomy is not ultimate. And judgment means I could not hide behind experience anymore. And here's the part that New Age really couldn't handle. New Age wants moral language, compassion, empathy, and healing, but it doesn't want any judgment. It wants to say love without saying law. And it wants to say growth, but it won't say sin. You can't say light without saying darkness. Because if evil is real, darkness is real. And if darkness is real, then you must explain it. And so the term misalignment that gets used in New Age doesn't explain it. Low vibration doesn't explain it. Perspective doesn't explain it. Deliberate cruelty is not a misunderstanding. It is a rebellion against good. And even an atheist could see that. So I kept searching inside of New Age, and I hoped someone else would give me a stronger grounding without forcing me to kneel. And I couldn't understand why moral grounding mattered to me personally. It was very personal. Because when I said that is wrong, I wasn't trying to win an argument there. I was trying to stay sane. Look, a man can endure a lot, but he cannot endure a world where nothing is truly wrong. That kind of world will make you numb. Or worse yet, it'll turn you into a monster. Because if nothing is truly wrong, then the child has no claim. If nothing is wrong, then the victim has no appeal. If nothing is wrong, evil wins by default, only because you've renamed it into neutrality. So even as an atheist, I clung to the moral language because it matched what I had lived. Abuse was not a lesson, it was a violation. War was definitely not a learning module. It contained deliberate cruelty. Betrayal is not a perspective, it was betrayal. And the moment you hold on to that, you are holding on to a standard. And it was there I began to see the trap. I wanted a universe without God, but I also wanted a universe where evil is condemned. I wanted to be free of judgment, but I also wanted justice. I wanted autonomy, but I also wanted meaning. But I wanted to be the final authority. But I also wanted a moral law that could stand over the man who harms a child. You can't have it both ways. Because if there's no authority above man, then the strongest man becomes the authority. If there's no lawgiver, then law is the only power. And if there is no judge, then justice is only revenge. If there is no objective good, then evil is only a word we use for what we dislike. Now, I've tried to live with that idea, but unfortunately I couldn't. Because the reasoning tightens again. When we call something evil, when I called something evil, I was claiming that it violated a real moral order. To say that it should not happen, I was claiming that there is a should built into the world. But that should is not a molecule. You can't weigh it. You can't measure it. All you can do is recognize it. And you do know it when you see it. And that recognition is not a social trend. A social trend can teach you manners, but it can't create a binding moral claim. The moral claim is deeper than manners. It says that even if you can, you must not. Even if nobody sees it, it is still wrong. It says that even if you benefit, you are still guilty. Again, that kind of language demands grounding. And once you admit grounding, you're already moving toward the idea of a moral authority that exists independent of your opinion. And I didn't want to go there. But again, my own conscience pulled me there. Those years between 2005 and 2012 is why I was not neutral. And I have to tell you something about those years. I wasn't sitting in a quiet room, calmly weighing all of these arguments. I was living with memory. I was living with grief. I was living with the after effects of war. I was living with the weight of a childhood wounds that never got named properly when they happened. I was living within this contradiction. I couldn't stop calling evil evil. I could not stop believing that justice mattered. I couldn't escape. But I also could not accept a personal God who sees and allows. So that created an internal stalemate internally. I didn't pray. I didn't seek church. I didn't want sermons. I didn't want hymns. I didn't want God talk. I wanted control. I wanted the world to be explainable without having to trust a God that I was ready to accuse. So when I finally decided in 2012 to study seriously, it was not an academic hobby. It was just a pressure release. It was a man saying, I have to know what is true because I cannot keep living in a fog of accusation and denial. Now, New Age offered me a doorway that didn't force me to kneel at the start, and that's why I went through it the way that I did. And what finally broke the spell that Neil Donald Walsh had on me is that when I look back, and I can see why he held on to me for so long as he did, because he removed God. And I can see why he held on to me for as long as he did, because his God removed guilt. And that's obvious. But it also removed a frightening question too. If Christ is true, then the child's song might be true. And if the child's song is true, then I have to ask why love didn't prevent the abuse. And that question felt unbearable to me. And so Walsh's system let me avoid it by making God non-judging and reality non-moral in the strongest sense. But the cost of that avoidance was also high. Because once you remove moral weight from evil, you also remove the moral weight from good. If there is no sin, then there is no holiness. If there is no guilt, then there's no innocence. And if there is no judgment, there's no vindication. No real wrong, no real right. And that is where Walsh couldn't follow me. His system wants me to keep the word love, but it removes the framework that makes love meaningful. Love is not merely a feeling. Love is ordered toward the good. And if there is no objective good, then love becomes just a mood. I couldn't accept that. Because I've also seen men love each other in sacrifice. I've seen loyalty. I've seen brothers lay down their lives. That's not a mood. That is moral beauty. But a moral beauty also implies a moral reality. And so, that spell broke. And it broke because the world is not neutral. It is moral. And once the world is moral, you have to answer these questions again and with seriousness. Who is God? Who is man? What went wrong? And how is it fixed? No amount of soothing language can remove those questions. They come back because reality keeps demanding an answer. Now, after that, I studied Deepak Chopra. And that moved into abstraction. Because after I fell out with Walsh, or after I stopped reading Walsh, then I moved into Deepak Chopra. And Chopra sounds very intellectual. He uses a lot of language about consciousness, the universe, quantum reality. But he dissolved God into an impersonal field. And at first that sounded sophisticated, and it sounded like a way to keep spirituality while avoiding a personal God, but an impersonal field cannot command, and an impersonal field cannot judge evil. An impersonal field cannot forgive, and forgiveness matters because wrong is real. So Chopra offered awareness, and he offered expansions of consciousness. He even offered unity. But awareness doesn't fix the will. And a man can be brilliant and he can be cruel. A man can understand consequences and still choose harm. So knowledge doesn't cure rebellion. So obviously Chopra couldn't solve the problem. He just moved the problem into abstraction. And what he gave me was a universe that felt peaceful, but peace without justice is not peace. It's just numbness. And I couldn't accept numbness because my life contained too much moral reality. And so I moved again, hoping not for abstraction, but maybe for mechanism. Because if a personal God's too threatening and abstraction's too thin, then maybe there's a law of reality that I can use, a technique that gives me control. And that's where The Secret came in. And so it's a book by Rhonda Byrne. There was also a documentary of sorts that I watched called What the Bleep Do We Know? And this was my last attempt. And I seriously didn't treat The Secret as a joke. I bought multiple copies of it. I gave copies of that book away. I practiced the mindset. I wanted it to be true. And the reason why is because it promised control. And what it said is that your thoughts shape your reality, that you attract what you focus on. It said that you can manifest your own outcomes. And that is highly intoxicating if you've ever felt powerless. You ever feel betrayed by reality and that you feel like that life can be cruel and it can be random? The Secret promised the universe that you could steer. And so I tried. But the moment you take it seriously, it makes this moral claim that it cannot escape. And that is, if you create your reality, then you create everything in it. So if you attract outcomes, then you attract tragedy. If you manifest your life, then victims manifest their own victimhood. Now, The Secret doesn't say this directly, and it uses a lot of positive language. It uses a lot of success stories and it sells hope, but logic does not care about marketing. So I had to deal with this. Did the abused child manifest the abuse? Did the homeless, starving man, did he manifest that starvation? Did the victim of the violence focus it into being? And if the answer to that is yes, then that system is cruel. But if the answer is no, then that system collapses. Because then thoughts do not govern reality the way that it claims. And at that moment, I began to reject New Age, not primarily for what it taught, but for what it refuses to say. It refuses to say, this is evil. This is a sin. This is rebellion, that man is accountable. You cannot save yourself. New Age wanted to give me comfort without submission. It wanted to give me meaning without authority. Spirituality without a judge. But my life didn't allow that because I knew something about myself. I knew I couldn't fix myself by technique. I know many of you, if you've ever promised yourself that you would change and then you failed, you know what I mean. If you've ever known the right thing and chosen the wrong thing anyway, you know what I mean. It's not ignorance. That's the will. And the will cannot be held up by any of these statements. And that whole New Age framework began to collapse under the weight of the questions. Who is God? New Age will give you a force. It'll give you a counselor. It'll even give you a mechanism. But none of those can establish moral law. And who is man? New Age treats man as divine enough to save himself. But man cannot save himself because he cannot even consistently govern himself. And what went wrong? New Age refuses to name even a rupture. It just calls it ignorance, calls it misalignment or perspective. But deliberate evil is not ignorance. And so how is it fixed? New Age offers awareness, alignment, even manifestation. But none of those forgive. None of them will restore justice. And none of those defeat death. And death matters. Because death is the one thing that no spiritual technique can negotiate away. And so New Age collapsed. Now, it was a gradual loss of credibility, but the more I faced the world honestly, the less New Age could explain any of it. And then something happened that forced me toward Christianity, the very thing I had avoided. Evidence. The Shroud of Turin. When I began to examine the Shroud of Turin, it was not approached devotionally at first. When I looked up the STIRP project team, I approached it skeptically. I accepted that the findings of it was true, that the carbon dating was correct, that it was some form of a medieval art piece. And I thought, well, that should collapse quickly under examination. And so if it's just some form of a pious fraud, then it should show the marks of fraud in a way that satisfies a very serious mind. So I began to study it. And I studied the claims and the counterclaims and the disputes. And then I came across the Sudarium of Oviedo, which I'd never heard of. But it turns out it was a separate cloth. It has a separate history. It intertwines with the shroud. But the Sudarium didn't replace the shroud. It just complemented it in a way that made the question even heavier. Because the question was no longer, is Christianity comforting? The main question I had was, is Jesus a real man in history? Now, the shroud pushed me toward that. And the Sudarium pushed me towards that. Because both of them point to the same crucified man. So then that means you're not dealing with a myth anymore. You're dealing with a body, a dead body. But then I had the most unsettling thought. If he is real, then I have to decide what to do with him. Because I can no longer dismiss him as a story. And I can't hide behind that denominational confusion. I can't say that religion is the problem and then move on, because Christianity doesn't stand or fall on vague spirituality. It either stands or falls on a historical claim. And that claim is the resurrection. Because if Christ didn't rise, Christianity collapses. But if Christ rose, then everything changes. And that is where fear entered into my story. And I'm not talking about the fear of like a ghost story. I'm talking about a fear of intellectual honesty. Because once I saw enough to take Jesus seriously as a real man, I could no longer honestly say that he didn't exist. If I could no longer say that he didn't exist, then the reason I skipped him became obvious. I skipped him because I did not want him to be true. I didn't want him to be true because if he's true, then I have to answer to him. And that is fear. The fear is not that God exists. The fear is that God exists and I am accountable. The fear is that my accusation may have been built on a distorted picture of God. And the fear is that the God I rejected may not be the Christ of history. And so I had reached this fork that if he's real, then either he's guilty or what he has said has been misinterpreted. And that's where I stood. And that is where I still had to stand for a time because I couldn't jump from Jesus is real to the church is true without dealing with the fractures that made me skip Christianity in the first place. But I also couldn't honestly remain where I was. And that's why the Shroud and the Sudarium didn't give me comfort. They gave me pressure. They forced me into a corner. And either Jesus is a real man who rose from the dead, and then I must ask what he established. Or if Jesus is a fraud, then the whole thing's a lie. But even my own study pushed me away from this fraud idea because it forced me toward a harder option. If he rose, then he has authority. And if he has authority, then my autonomy is not ultimate. And if my autonomy is not ultimate, then I must face truth rather than hide inside of a preference. And I didn't want that. So yes, fear. Fear because intellectual honesty doesn't let you stop where you like. It forces you to follow the evidence. You have to follow the logic, and it forces you to face your own motives. And my motive was clear. I avoided Christ because I didn't want him to be true. But I also could no longer honestly reject his existence, and I couldn't keep avoiding him. So I couldn't keep hiding behind the idea that religion is the problem because now the problem might be me. Not my feelings, not my thoughts, my refusal, my resistance to authority, my resistance to accountability. And so that is where I will end this New Age episode. Not with any kind of neat resolution here, but with a turning point. New Age couldn't carry the moral weight of reality. It couldn't name evil without dissolving it. It couldn't speak of justice without turning it into a preference. And it couldn't speak of suffering without implying that the victim chose that. It couldn't fix the will. It couldn't defeat death. And it couldn't answer the question that finally cornered me. If evil is real, good is real. If good is real, it must be grounded. And if it is grounded beyond man, authority exists. And if authority exists, accountability exists. And if Christ rose, then his authority is not an idea. It's a claim on me. And that is why I avoided him. And that is why I feared him. And that is why next week, I will not avoid Christianity anymore. Next week, we will look at Christianity and the questions. And we'll pick up all the pieces and we're going to trace all of the divisions and we're going to examine the denominations. And we're going to ask how the fracture happens. And we're going to look for the original. Because if Christ rose, he didn't leave the world with 45,000 denominations and 40,000 non-denominationals of competing truths. He established something. He entrusted something and he gave authority. And either that authority continued or it did not. And if it continued, then it is still identifiable. If it did not, then Christianity becomes a permanent civil war of interpretation, and Christ becomes a source of confusion rather than truth. And I cannot accept that without evidence. So next week, we're going to follow the evidence. We're going to look at the history and the logic, whether we like where it leads or not, because that is what intellectual honesty demands. Once the shroud made Jesus real to me, intellectual honesty became the only path left. And that is where we will go next on Veritate. May God bless you.
Thank you for listening to Veritate. If you would like to contact the show, please email us at veritate@yahoo.com. That's veritate@yahoo.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to hearing from you. May God bless you all.